Welcome to Train Signal. You're watching using Update Manager. So let's talk a little bit about Update Manager. Odds are, again, I'll go back to my VCP level knowledge statement, but you probably already know what Update Manager does. I want you to understand some of the other features that you may not often use and just have a good review, because I don't want you to get tripped up on something on the exam because you just kind of gloss over it and you think I got this covered. So let's do a review of Update Manager. So Update Manager is a tool that helps to patch vSphere hosts and update VMware tools. It used to do guest patching, Windows and Linux. Nobody ever used it. All my customers that I ever saw, not one ever used the guest patching, which is why VMware dropped it. And then they went and bought Shavlik for the vCenter Protect suite, and then they sold that. But anyway, the nice thing is it makes your life simpler, especially as far as the exam, because you only have to worry about vSphere updates, patches, and VMware tools. It also installs some third-party software. Cisco Nexus 1000V, PowerPath VE, those are two common extensions that I see installed and kept up to date using Update Manager. But really, at the end of the day, they are just VIBs that get installed within vSphere, and you just point them to a different repository. So for you and me, it's not a whole lot of a different process, but just note that it does do that, and sometimes you will see those added in to your update groups. It's installed as a separate component and has its own database. So you still access it via plugin in the VI client, but it still requires, a separate ODBC connection, a separate database, and it does take a separate install. So a lot of people run it on the vCenter server for smaller installs. Some people will do a dedicated Update Manager server. Doesn't really matter. That's kind of up to you, sizing and all that. But it is a separate piece of the installation. A couple of concepts for Update Manager: baselines and baseline groups. Often there are many patches and upgrades, so you don't want to go through and have 250 updates and figure out which ones you want to install and which ones you don't and all that. So you can put them into baselines. A baseline is a group of patches or other third-party extensions, but it's basically, your baselines are your groups. You could have one baseline, you could have 10 baselines. It doesn't matter. It's completely up to you, but that's how you group your patches and your updates together. Baseline group is a selection of baselines. So the idea is if you have 5 baseline groups, maybe you have a third-party one, a security one, a critical update one, you can roll those up into an overall update baseline group. You can also have one baseline be a part of a baseline group, and it's a one-to-one relationship. Doesn't really save you a lot, but maybe you'll add a different baseline later and you'll add it in and you have 2 of them in the group. It's up to you. But just understand that updates go into baselines and baselines combine together into baseline groups. You then attach these to a host or a cluster. Check compliance and remediate if you need to. Firewall ports. This is something that they spell out in the blueprint. I hate it when they do stuff like this, where they say, memorize the 87 ports you need to communicate with things. But just keep this in mind. I don't know if they'll really quiz you. I mean, it is a lab, but I wouldn't put it past them to have some squirrely question about ports and firewalls and all that. So keep that in mind. So ports between Update Manager and other objects. It talks to vCenter server on port 80. vSphere hosts connect to the Update Manager web server on port 9084. Update Manager connects back to vSphere hosts on the standard port 902. Update Manager plugin connects to the Update Manager server on port 8084. So when you run the plugin, it hits the server on 8084. Update Manager web server listens on port 9087, which is SSL, for uploading host upgrade files. And the whole thing connects to vMware.com for metadata information on port 443. We'll talk about Update Manager download service in a minute, but for a straight connectivity to VMware, it does connect on 443. So 80, 9084, 902, 8084, 9087, and 443. Try to remember those. Good luck to you. But it is as part of the blueprint. So if any ports are already in use when Update Manager is installed, it will choose and open new ones. So it'll do it in the range of 9,000 to 9,100, and it automatically opens these ports. Update Manager download service. So let's say you're in a normal environment. vCenter is internal. Update Manager is internal. You don't let things like that on the management network talk to the internet. Security, compliance, stuff like that. What do you do? How do you get patches? Well, one option is the Update Manager Download Service, UMDS. It's used if Update Manager can't talk to the internet directly. And it's really just a simple service that goes and grabs the new updates and drops them in a directory somewhere. But there are some prereqs that you need to be aware of. Installed on a 64-bit Windows OS. MS SQL database using a 32-bit ODBC connection, and I'm not sure if I mentioned that earlier, but that is still the way Update Manager itself is. It's still 32-bit ODBC, which is one of those little quirky things that still drives me nuts. And don't install on the same server as the Update Manager, which I'm going to question why you would, since you're not allowing Update Manager to talk to the internet. But I will give you a word of caution. UMDS is very simple. It's a simple install. We'll see it in the lab. It's all configured via CLI. It's a simple configuration. But it's not a complete solution. What I mean by that is this. It goes out and it downloads the patches that you dictate, and it drops them in a directory. Well, how does Update Manager get those files? That's kind of up to you. What a lot of people do is they will use IIS to host an internal website and use that as a repository that they type into Update Manager, but that's not part of UMDS. It's not part of the install. You have to do that. So if you want to do that, I don't think they're going to hit you up at this level on the exam. I would think not, because IIS or no other web servers on the blueprint, but you never know. I don't think they would do that. But if you want to do this in production, then there's some good blog posts out there. One that I've used before is from a friend of mine, Jace McCarty. Jace has one on his blog, and his blog is jacemccarty.com, Jas as in Sam, EMCCARTY.com. And if you look there, he's got one, let's see, I have it up in another window. It's called VMware Update Manager Download Service on Windows 2008 R2 Core. And he walks you through how he did the install for IIS. So just, heads up, it's not a complete solution. What I would know for the exam is how to install it, the commands to configure it, and just any tweaking that you may need to be done. I don't think that'll be in scope as far as, a web server. Configured via CLI, I'll show you in the lab. It's pretty simple. You basically say, I want to download these patches but not those patches, and you can go download it. You need to schedule it because it's not a scheduled service. So you use something like Windows Scheduler to do it, and I'll go back to my good buddy Jace again. Jace actually talks about that in his blog post if you want to do it, but it's just using Windows Scheduler, kicking off the VMware UMDS command to go download it. So you can do that however often you want to. One thing that you can do in Update Manager, and that's a great tie-in to what we just talked about, is create a shared repository. So it's something that you would manage and you would approve the updates. So it could be a web server like the IIS server that I just talked about for UMDS. Or it could be a server held by, say, a compliance or checking group. Some larger organizations have a group that do nothing but download software patches or drivers or firmware updates or whatever, test them in a lab, and go yes or no. And so they may manage that, approve it, and drop those into what we call a shared repository. And that way you don't pull things down from VMware directly. So again, you can create it using UMDS, and it can be a local directory, not a networked mapped file share. It has to be a local directory on the server or a web server, one of those two. You can also perform VMware host upgrades using Upgrade Manager. A couple of caveats. You can upgrade from ESXi 4 to ESXi 5. You can do what we call a migration from ESX4, remember that's the old fat install of ESX, to ESXi 5, but it does not migrate hosts if you upgraded them from fat ESX3 to fat ESX4, but due to some partition layout differences. So if you upgraded from ESX3 to ESX4, the partition layout was a little different than just a new install of ESX4. So keep all that in mind. My tip to you is I don't ever do this. We rarely ever do in-place upgrades of vSphere hosts. It's too easy to do a new install and make sure everything is new, good, and happy. But depending on which exam you get, they may ask you about host upgrades since it is on the blueprint, so understand that. And it's done as an orchestrated rolling upgrade. So DRS migrates VMs off the host, puts the host in maintenance mode, does the upgrade, and then it reboots the host, brings it up, pulls back the cluster, takes it out of maintenance mode, and then moves on to the next one. So it's a fairly painless thing as long as it goes well. And it's pretty slick and it works, but I normally do manual upgrades through a cluster. If you have a lot of hosts, that may not work for you. It just depends, but this does work well. The upgrade steps: configure Update Manager host and cluster settings. We'll see that in the lab. Import an ESXi image in ISO format, just when you download, whatever standard image you want to use, unless you need an OEM image for your server vendor, but whichever, grab it in ISO format. You could also use the image builder CLI, we'll talk about in another lesson, to build an ISO with any custom drivers that you may need. So pick one of those options, but just get you an ISO image. Create a host upgrade baseline, which is similar to other baselines. We'll see it in the lab. Then attach the newly created baseline to a container meaning like a cluster, data center, or folder. Scan the container, review the scan results, and then remediate the container, and it'll walk through doing an update. Now, we're not going to see all that in the lab, mainly because all my lab is vSphere 5.1, so there's nothing to update. But it's a good idea to know it. I'll be honest, I don't expect that in the lab to actually do a host upgrade, mainly because that's going to totally screw up your lab if something goes wrong, and it's time consuming. But know how to create those baselines, know how to have one ready in case they have you say, create this, get it ready, but don't actually do the upgrade. I mean, I could understand things like that, but I doubt they're going to actually have you walk it all the way through. It's a good idea to know the process. So now let's talk about troubleshooting Update Manager. There's a lot of things to cover. I mean, there's downloads, there's patches, there can be conflicting patches, so I don't want to go through 1,000 examples. A couple of things. Check database connectivity. That's the first one. If it's just not running or it's acting weird, make sure the ODBC connection's good, make sure database up, do a check connectivity status on ODBC, make sure everybody's happy. For some reason patches aren't coming down, obviously check internet connectivity from either Update Manager or UMDS. Check free space on the vSphere host. That's a good one. Because it'll try to push down and stage patches, but if there's not enough space to hold them, it's going to error out. So check that. Check for conflicting updates in the baseline. A lot of times it'll tell you that when you do it, but I've seen odd occurrences where things would try to apply, but it didn't pick up a conflict and there was an issue. Highly suggest you read the troubleshooting section, section 17 in the Update Manager Guide. Nothing crazy in here, but it's just a good review of what you might run into. I could see a question on the exam around, hey, go do this, or, admin so-and-so is having a problem, go resolve this issue with Update Manager. So it's probably worth taking a look. That's not a long section, so it's a good review. Also, along with that, one area to look at on your vSphere hosts, if you do have an issue, say staging patches or applying an update, there is an ESX update log under var log. We talked about this in the logging section. So check that. I actually had this on one of mine the other day. It was trying to apply an extension for something that it thought was installed but wasn't. It was causing a conflict, and it was spelled out in that ESX update log. So that's another great area. If you hit a problem, go jump, and you're not getting any real tangible information from, say, the GUI in vCenter or the plugin, go check that log. Exporting baselines. You can export and import patch baselines between Update Manager installs using Power CLI. Script is available, so I don't want you to feel like I'm just throwing you to the manual here, but go look at the manuals and look at section 16, and I think you'll understand why I don't put the script in front of you. It's a fairly lengthy script, but it is also cut and paste. So if you were to get this question on the exam of, hey, go export these baselines, you're not going to remember this script. I guarantee that. But you should know it's in section 16 of the Update Manager Admin Guide, and just copy, paste, and run it, and off you'll go. So, just know where to look for. Generating reports. Update Manager provides no reporting mechanism itself. You can generate reports yourself using Excel and MS SQL. It's not user-friendly. I really wish they'd streamline this. By not user-friendly, I mean I consider it to be almost worthless. It's similar to the Power CLI script. There is a provided SQL query script. So again, section 17. I would hope they don't ask you to do this in the exam, because I mean, I guess they could. But if they do, just go to section 16, look at the SQL query script, and execute that. I would hope not, but you never know. But it's really an ugly output. It is not pretty. It's not something that I would want to do on anything close to a regular basis. But we got to hit it because this exact item is in the blueprint. So understand what you need to do. You may want to run through it one time in your lab if at all possible, just so you say you've done it. But again, not something I'd want to do regularly. So let's do a lab for Update Manager. So in the lab, we're going to review the install Update Manager, configure it, discuss some options, create a baseline and baseline group, attach the groups to an object, scan the object, remediate the object, and then I'm going to walk you through Update Manager download service and show you a quick install and how to configure that guy so you'll know how to do it. So with that, let's go ahead and let's jump over to the lab. Alright, so here we are in the lab, and what we're going to do is install Update Manager onto the vCenter server. So I've got the vCenter files here. I'll go ahead and kick off auto run, go to the products, Update Manager, and install. And again, this may be old hat for you, but it's worth at least going through the install if someone hasn't seen it. Also pay attention to a couple of the settings during installation. So it'll go ahead and take a look at Visual C++. Some of this may already be installed because I've done this before. So if you see a couple of other subcomponents get installed, that may be why. We'll start with the license agreement, of course, and then we go into Update Manager. It'll say it'll upgrade your host. Do you want me to go ahead and start downloading updates from the default sources immediately? I want to say yes, because I have access to the internet and I want it to go ahead and start as we're talking. Next is your vCenter server information, so it can install the plugin. Make sure I get that right. And it's going to say, what do you want to use for a database? So Update Manager does require a database. You can use either the SQL Express for small installs, which was what I'm going to do, or you can host it on an external database, which is probably what you're going to want to do in production. Just remember, it is still a 32-bit DSN. Not 64-bit like the newer versions of vCenter and everything. So just keep that in mind. That's a good gotcha. So we'll say Express, and it's going to tell me that my database already exists, which it does. Do I want to override it? Yes. Then you tell it the IP or host name to use to be identified on the network, the ports for SOAP, web, and SSL. And if you do need to set a proxy, you can do that here. You do have an option to do it later, but you can go ahead and do it up front. Then it's going to say I'm going to install to this directory, and I'm going to download patches to this directory. It will warn you, like it's going to warn me here in a second, that I don't have 120 gig free on this volume. So you may want to create another drive and host your patches. It depends. If you tell it not to download, ESX 3 and 4 patches, it uses less space. But it's usually a good idea to put that on a separate drive so you don't accidentally fill up your C drive. But it's a lab, so next. And there it is, free space less than 120 gig. And they do point you to a sizing estimator at this URL here that works pretty well. And install. So go ahead, we'll let that install, then we'll take a look at the configuration. Alright, we'll click Finish. We'll close that. And we'll go ahead and launch our client's already open, so let's see if we need to do anything with the plugin. So we'll do Manage Plugins, we'll scroll to the bottom, vSphere Update Manager, and now we'll have to download and install the client. So Update Manager is a little bit more than just a simple plugin. So you click that, it'll grab the client. Again, that's another install, but it's quick. Accept the license agreement, and go. Let that go, and we're done. Easy enough. Close, go back to our home screen, and down at the bottom we should see an Update Manager icon appear here in a second. Maybe. It says download and install again. It should have already done that. Let me close and open my client again. There we go. Okay, so we'll click on that. And this will walk you through a little bit of what you need to do. Tells you a little bit about the admin view and the compliance view. and some basic tasks. So it should already be downloading patches. We can actually go to patch repository and see, and it is. So if we had told it not to download patches, this would be blank. So that's good. And then it talks about compliance view that I'll show you and your baseline and baseline groups. But first, let's look at some of the configuration options. So jump to the config tab, and here's a couple of things. First, here's the port that SOAP is going to use. Here's your server port range, 80 and 9000 through 9100. And here's the IP address that you're going to use for the patch store. Download settings, you can do a direct connection, which is what I'm doing, and it's going out and downloading patches from these repositories. So you have the VMware repository for ESX, ESXi. You have a custom repository. If we scroll this out, you will see CSCO maintenance. It's Cisco. So basically updates for the Nexus 1000V line of stuff. And then you have VMware VAs, which are virtual appliances. So you can update many of the virtual appliances, as we'll look at a list here in a minute, and it'll grab updates for that. If you want to add a download source, you can click Add Download Source here and punch in some information. For example, back when the Nexus 1000V first shipped from Cisco, there wasn't a built-in repository, so we had to go add a download source. So you may need to do that. You can use a shared repository like we talked about in the slides. We'll look at this with the Update Manager download service. But you may also have a compliance group that certifies patches, drops them on a web server or somewhere, and you could point to that URL. Just remember, it can be a URL or a local file or a local directory. It cannot be a network mapped directory. So we'll do direct. Again, here's where you set your proxy settings if you need them for connectivity. Schedule. Discard. Schedule just says how often do you want me to go download updates and patches. By default, it's daily, and it'll just pick a time depending on when you install stuff, and you can adjust that here with your edit schedule. If you hit next here, you can also add notifications, assuming that your mail config is correct, but it's a good idea if you want to do that if you have a problem with downloads or there's some new patches, it'll let you know. These are great little sticking points in exams that I think, because they'll say something like, go configure so-and-so to happen once a day, and make sure Bob at examplecorp.com gets notified if there's a problem. Well, that's where you do things like that. So make sure you know where your notifications are set. There's a notification check schedule. It's just like the download schedule. You can do the schedule, you can do email notifications, all that. If you notice, this is set to run hourly. This goes and checks with VMware to see if there's any issues with patches you need to be aware of. So if VMware recalls a patch, you'll check hourly for that. So if there's a problem with a patch, you'll know about it, hopefully before they get applied. And the idea is it's a quick way to kind of alert you. And you will sometimes see a recalled patch in the repository. So that's why it's checking. And that's why you'll see those check notification tasks in vCenter once an hour that people are always like, what is that? And that's what this is. VM settings, you can tell it to take a snapshot. So if you update VMware tools, you can say, okay, after update VMware tools, keep a snapshot for 48 hours. So I've got 2 days to make a decision if I want to maintain that or roll it back. After 2 days, it'll delete the snapshot automatically. I do not suggest you say do not delete snaps, simply because people will forget, they leave them, they fill up data stores, and they call me all in a panic, and we have to clean that out. So I don't suggest you do that. Set it for a specific time. Host and cluster settings. Here's some settings. You'll see them here, and you'll also see them if you manually kick off an update task. But it basically says, what do you want me to do when I put a host in maintenance mode? So do you want me to do anything to the VMs? Normally, if you say do not change VM power state, it'll just, assuming you have DRS set for automated, it'll put a host in maintenance mode and migrate or evacuate the VMs off. You can tell it to power off the VMs or suspend them. I wouldn't do that. Most people don't either. They just evacuate the VMs, but you do have that option. You can temporarily disable any removable media when it goes into maintenance mode. So have you ever had anybody attached to a CD-ROM or something, and then you couldn't put a host in maintenance mode? It just sat there at 2%. It doesn't tell you, hey, this VM's attached to something and I can't move it. It just sits at 2% till you figure it out. So you can say temporarily disable any removable media that might prevent that. Retry entering maintenance mode. It'll just retry every 5 minutes, 3 times by default if there's an issue. So if you fix a problem in 5 minutes, it'll try to go into maintenance mode again. Cluster settings, you can have it disable some functions. So You can say temporarily disable dynamic power management, HA, FT. You can enable parallel remediation, so it can start patching multiple vSphere hosts in a cluster to go faster. You can tell it, do you want to migrate powered off and suspended VMs when the host goes to maintenance mode? So to reboot a host, you just need to evacuate the running VMs. The powered off VMs, templates, things like that can just stay registered to the host. The reason you probably want to migrate these off is because what happens if you patch a host, it reboots and doesn't come back up? All of a sudden, you've got disconnected VMs. Now, you can remove them from inventory, browse the data store, re-add them back in, but it's a manual process. So I always suggest you migrate them off. It does add a little bit more time. Usually it's only a few more seconds for each host, but it'll save you if something happens to one of them. And then you've got PXE booted hosts. So think auto deploy. If I do a stateless boot of a vSphere host over the network, do I want Update Manager to apply patches to it? Well, probably not. You probably want to add those patches into your updated image file. But on a temporary basis, you could say, yeah, I want you to go ahead and allow installation to a PXE booted host, because that way we can do some patches. You know, if it requires a reboot, that's going to negate a lot of what we're doing here, because it's going to reboot back off your image again. But it will let you do some patches for those hosts until you add them into the image. So that's up to you. And we hit apply. Then you have vApps. So one of the items in a blueprint is smart rebooting of vApps, which I think is crazy because it's one item in a blueprint that is literally this checkbox right here. What this does, or actually, if you're not familiar with vApps are kind of like a VM container. In a good example of that, I believe I still have it set up this way, is vCenter Operations. So this is a vApp. And if I click it, right-click it, and edit settings of the vApp, you can do things like set resources, much like a resource pool. You can set properties, like time zone. You can set how they're IP'd. You can mainly do start order. So this is set so that when it boots, when I start the vApp, it boots the analytics VM first. It waits to their 1800 seconds or VMware tools are ready, and then it starts the UI VM. So then it goes and starts its little actions. When you do a shutdown, it'll wait 120 seconds or until the machine is powered off before it powers down the analytics VM. So it's a way to set up startup and shutdown order. And why this is important is what happens if I patch the back-end analytics VM and reboot it? It's going to break the connectivity to the front-end UI VM. Now, they're probably smart enough they'll reconnect when they come back up, but maybe not. So what you can do is say enable smart reboot after remediation, and if I have to patch something with dependencies, it'll reboot all the machines in that vApp in the proper order as dictated by the vApp, and that's called smart reboot. So simple option, but it's a way to keep your dependency order correct within the vApps. Events are just events. Notifications are anything you need to be aware of. Patch repository lists all your patches, anything that's been downloaded. ESXi image. So if you want to do a host upgrade from, say, ESXi 4 to 5, you have to assign images. So if we do import image, it's going to say give me an image. We'll browse to the image. And I've actually got one sitting right here on the desktop. And that's an ISO file that I downloaded from VMware, so we'll ignore the certificate warning. And it'll start logging in and processing it. I wonder how many certificate warnings I've ignored through my life. Probably a lot. So once it pulls this in and processes it, it's kind of like some of the stuff out of the image builder CLI that we'll get to in another lesson, where it'll show you the drivers and VIBs that are built into it, and you can see what's actually in the image. That way, if you do a custom image, you can make sure you see what you expect to see. So now Update Manager is going to import, and we should be good to go. There we go. It says I imported this one from VMware 5.1. Here's your build number, blah, blah, blah. Next. And then you say, do you want to go ahead and create a baseline? So this will be a baseline if you actually wanted to run a host upgrade. So we'll do host upgrade baseline vcap. And you can do a description if you like. But that's it. And we'll look at that baseline in a second. But you can have multiple images. you attach an image to a baseline, and then you apply that to a host to do an upgrade. And again, here's all the drivers and VIBs that are part of that package. VA upgrade, these are virtual appliances. So virtual appliances are things like the VMA, vCenter Orchestrator, Data Director, things like that. Some of these you have to click the end user license agreement, accept it, hit OK, and it'll change that. But it gives you a way to update your virtual appliances. That way it makes it a little more automated and simple. So those are shown here. Really, it's only the VMware ones, obviously, but it gives you what the upgrades are and all that. So now let's go back and talk about baselines and groups. Yep. So there's a couple of built-in baselines. Now remember, a baseline is a group of patches. We have a whole bunch of patches in the repository that I don't want to manage on a individual basis. So we create baselines. Baselines group those packages. Then we can group these baselines into baseline groups. So, for example, a baseline group could include a host upgrade from 4 to 5, a critical patches baseline, which is all the critical security and problem patches from VMware, and then say an extension baseline, which would add third-party software like EMC's PowerPath VE. You could put all that in a baseline group and basically throw a whole bunch of stuff at a host at one time. But you don't have to. You can create a baseline with some set packages, attach those to a host or a cluster, and do it without building a group. It's very flexible depending on how you want to do it. But let's build a baseline. So we'll do create, we'll do demo baseline, and then you pick the type. So you want to do virtual appliance, you want to do a host upgrade like the one we just created out of that image. If you do that, it's basically going to say pick your image. If you do virtual appliance, it's going to tell you you actually set up rules here that determine the target upgrade version for the virtual appliance. You can do host extensions. It's telling me it's going to reset my settings every time I click something new. Host extensions, which are going to be other things, other supplied drivers, Cisco's virtual Ethernet module, that sort of thing. Or we'll just do host patches. And then you can say fixed, which just says go into the repository and tell me exactly which patches you want to include. Or we do dynamic and we set some rules. So dynamic, we could say VMware, any product, any severity, any category. If you do all, it'll actually which one it applies to, but that really is more for these third parties. So we'll say anything from VMware, critical, and any, and then you can set a time frame. So owner after a certain date, owner before a certain date. And actually, let's just do security patches, bug fixes, enhancements. Let's do bug fixes since that's the smallest number. Okay. So here's all the patches it's going to put in here. Some are 4.1, some are 5, some of them will not apply to my host. If you want to exclude anything in particular, you can exclude that here. Just select, move down, and it'll exclude it. If there's any that you want to add, so you've set up your rules, you captured a bunch of them, but if there's some that didn't get captured by your rules that you still want to add, you could manually add those here. Next, and it's going to say here's all the patches, and finish. So we have created our baseline right there. Now we can create a group, host baseline group. Next. Do you want to do a host baseline? So this is where you can stack multiple types together. I'm going to say no because I don't have any 4.0 hosts or 4.1 hosts. Which patch baseline? We'll do the one we just created, but you can do multiples. Again, you group these together. Next. Any extension baselines, third party? We didn't create any, so no. And that's everything, and finish. So it creates the group. Now we need to jump over to what we call compliance view. So we've created our baselines, we've created our groups, we got everything ready. And compliance view is basically just you go to a cluster or you go to a host and you go over here to the right to Update Manager, and this is compliance view. Now we want to attach our new baseline group to our cluster. So again, you can attach individual baselines at the top or a group at the bottom. You can even create them if you forgot to do that before you get here, and say attach. And then we're going to say scan, and it's going to scan to see how we are as far as compliance with the update. So go ahead, nobody's compliant. So let's pick a host and try it. So we'll do Mr. Megatron here. Update Manager. So we do a baseline group, demo baseline. There's 2 patches that apply to him that are having a little bit of issue there. Sometimes you'll see these as missing if they get rolled up into other patches or something like that. It's not too much to worry about. We'll go ahead and stage these patches. And staging basically means that we're copying patches to the server, but we're not deploying them yet. And the idea here is that you may have a bunch of hosts and some patches, and you have a maintenance window at midnight. And you don't want to sit there at midnight watching this bar go across the screen for all your hosts. So what you can do is you can stage them in the middle of the day, and then when you get ready at night, as soon as your maintenance window opens, you can start the remediation process and kind of speed this up a little bit. So we'll go ahead and see if those stage. I had a problem with this in the lab the other day, so I'm curious to see if they stage properly. I actually, you may get a troubleshooting lesson here real quick if it fails, but I had to go remove a software package. If this thing fails, the best place to go look is on the host. If you remember from our logging lesson, there's under var log is an esx update.log file. Anytime you push down patches, that's, anything gets written to that log file and it'll show any errors. And it was basically saying it was failing on Fault Domain Manager, which is the service or package for HA. And I looked it up on Google, and other people have hit similar issues. You remove FDM and the patch is applied fine, and I just re-enable HA. Odd problem, but it just shows that that's where you go, esxupdate.log, if you have an issue. So it says it worked. Let's try to remediate and see what happens. So demo baseline, we'll say next. Here's our patches. It says, give me a name for the job and when do you want to run it, so you can schedule this, or you can do it immediately. I'll do it immediately. You can override our maintenance mode and our cluster settings that we saw earlier. I'm going to leave them default. Again, you can override these, as well as disable DPM. I told it to migrate powered off and suspended, so we're good to go there. And now we'll do finished, and off it'll go. So let's see, and it fails. Let me guess, error 7. Unknown error. Let me try another host. Some of these I've fixed and some I have not. So let me try the other host real quick before we dive too deep into debug. But what it should do is apply patches. It'll actually put the host in maintenance mode, evacuate to VMs, apply the patches, reboot the host, bring it up with a new build number. Actually, I've got a newer build number here. This is one that I demoed the other night that worked. So let's remediate. Both of these actually staged. That's a good sign. See if it goes. That's looking better. Let's see what he's doing. So he is now putting the host in maintenance mode. If I can get my screen to cooperate. There we go, RDP. So it's remediating the host. It's putting it in maintenance mode. It's evacuating the VMs, so it'll migrate those off. And then it'll go ahead and apply the patches and reboot the host. Now, you don't have to do this on a host-by-host basis. We can come up here to Cybertron, select all these, hit remediate, and it'll do the same thing for the entire cluster. So what it'll do is it'll go through one by one, put the host in maintenance mode, patch it, reboot it, go to the next one. If you turn on parallel remediation, it'll try to do more than one, and it should speed up the process if you have the resources in your cluster. So, most people, that's what they do, is they don't go individual. They'll go to the cluster and just watch it remediate as it walks through. So it's now in maintenance mode. It's patching. We'll see if it reboots. And I know we had a problem on Megatron here, but usually Update Manager is fairly solid. You have to remember this is my lab environment that I break and install and uninstall and sometimes don't properly uninstall software. So it's not unusual for there to be a patch conflict or a problem due to some older software that's not, like a kernel module that's not pulled off a host. So not too big of an issue. And I just heard Bumblebee reboot. He beeps at me every time he does it, so I just heard him reboot. We see that he's finally gone offline there. When he comes back, it should check it and then take it out of maintenance mode. So while we're waiting for that to finish, the next thing we're going to look at is the Update Manager download service, which is fairly simple. I talked about this in the slide deck. It is a service that just goes out, downloads these patches like we saw in the patch repository, and drops them in a directory. And what you do with them beyond that is up to you. The glue that puts those together is either some sort of a job that moves those files into an internal repository on your side of the firewall that you get to with the repository setup in Update Manager. It can be, something that copies them to the local server. It could be a web server, IIS. I mentioned Jace's article or blog post on that. So there's a lot of ways to do it. I wouldn't be too concerned with that stuff for the exam because I think that's outside the scope of the blueprint. But do make sure you understand how to do Update Manager, the service, and all that. So as soon as this guy reconnects, we'll start that. Host is back online. We see that here. Give it 1 second to check the progress, and it should pull it out of maintenance mode. Comes out of maintenance mode. And everything it's already starting to vMotion VMs back over to it. Still waiting for the remediation to end here. Maybe he's not vMotioning that one to that one because he's not ready yet. Well, it did. vMotioned him there. Still coming out of maintenance mode though. And there we go. One host completed successfully if you saw that go by real quick, and this guy's now patched. A lot of times your build numbers will update. It depends on what exactly you patched. I patched this one the other day, which bumped that one up. But if you look at my other host, there's still the 799.733 build, and this is a much newer build. So sometimes you will see that get updated, sometimes not. It just, again, all depends on the patch level. So that's Update Manager. That is how to install, how to configure, what your options are. Remember Smart Reboot, how to add your ESXi images, how to create a baseline and then baseline groups. We talked about going to compliance view. We attach the baselines or groups to a cluster or a host. We scan to see what needs to be applied. We stage the patches, and then we remediate the host or cluster. So now let's go ahead and jump over to UMDS. So I'm going to use this host for UMDS. 161 is his IP. And we need to map over to the vCenter file. So I'll do that here. Directory here called UMDS. It's not part of auto run. So go to UMDS. There's two options here. One is listed as the installer. That's not the one you run. If you run that, it's going to error out and say go run this one. So go run that one. Say OK. And it's a pretty simple installation. It doesn't really talk to anything since it's meant to be sitting outside of a firewall. Next, license agreement, just look familiar. It also requires a database. Small installs, again, you can do the SQL Express, or you can do an external existing database. I don't see this used, UMDS used a lot, but a lot of people do the SQL Express just because it's a containerized type solution without a separate database server. So it's up to you. It's just a patch repository, so it's not keeping too much. I'll say Express. It's going to say already exists because I've already done this. Do I want to overwrite? Yes. If you still have proxy settings wherever UMDS is installed, this is where you configure all that and check it. And then we'll say next. It's going to install to this directory, and it's going to download patches to here. Much like Update Manager, it's going to yell at me if there's less than 120 gig of disk. So you may want to attach another disk or something like that. Again, it depends, and I'll show you how to tweak down the options that you're downloading. But just, you may want to change that. And of course, it yells at me again, and it gives you the link to the sizing tool. So we'll say, yeah, and hit install. So we'll let that finish, and then we start configuration. So this is all done via the CLI. It's in the program files x86 directory, VMware, infrastructure, update manager. Oop, it kicked off a job behind me. Update manager. And a whole bunch of stuff. So the tool you care about is VMware umds.exe. And it gives you a whole bunch of stuff. So a couple of things. First of all, let's figure out what's being downloaded. So that's the VMware umds-G. Got to be capital G. And it says, okay, here's all the stuff. So here's your URLs, here's your repositories, here's your patch store location, your proxy config, and here's what we're downloading. So we're downloading everything for ESX4, ESXi, embedded 4, I guess you'd call it, ESX41, embedded 4.1, 5, and 5.1. I don't care about most of that stuff, so I'm going to remove some of it. So the way you do it is VMware umds-s, which is setting the config, -delete to remove a package. And I'm going to do ESX4.0.0.international, ESX-4.1.0-international. And if we do get, it didn't remove it. Why didn't it remove it? Enabled. Oh, I'll put an extra period in that one. That's why. And there we go. Disabled, disabled. So if we do a G, we will no longer download those. Well, you know what? I also don't care about embedded 4 since I'm in a 5 environment. And embedded is just going to be ESXi. It's another name. So now I'm only downloading the vSphere 5.0 and 5.1 stuff. So I don't care about the other. I don't have any of that environment. I don't need to store it. You can also do things like enable and disable virtual appliances. So VMware umds, enable VA. There it is. It's --, not 1-. And you can also do disable. There we go. So if you want to download the virtual appliance updates, that's how you do that. Then you just tell it to start downloading. So downloading is just VMware umds-d, and it'll start kicking off a job to download patches. And off it goes. I'm going to cancel this because I don't need those. But you probably don't want to do this manually, so you're going to want to do an add job or something like that. As Jace talks about, he talks about using the schedule task command built into Windows, so you can use that to do it as well. But you just want to kick that off and have it run daily or whatever, and it'll go grab whatever it needs to grab. But I mean that's really UMDS right there. So just understand that it is a separate install. You got to go to the directory, do the install, point it to a database, run the VMware UMDS commands to disable whatever you don't need, check it with the -G, and then use the -D to kick off a download job, and then probably want to schedule that. But that's it. That's it for the lab. Let's jump back to the slides. And that's it for the lesson. So probably some review here for you, maybe some stuff that you haven't used yet, but the idea being it is a way to automatically update hosts to the latest version of vSphere by creating those host upgrade baselines. You can do patch baselines. We didn't actually look at the VM tools baseline, but it's, instead of doing a host upgrade baseline, you just do a virtual machine baseline, and it selects your tools and your options, much like your patches. And then you can attach those to a host or a cluster, scan, stage, and remediate. And if you need to have a download service outside your firewall, you just use UMDS. So again, it's simple. Just know the process for each of these, what you need to do. You may get questions. I always look for what I think would be good questions going by the blueprint. And I think things like creating a specific baseline, maybe with a date range, or attaching a certain baseline to a certain set of objects and staging patches would probably be a good one. So things like that I think are great opportunities for exam questions. But that's it for this lesson. Look forward to seeing you on the next one.